Well, I'm going to start off my talk by actually thanking Adam. So this will be a little reciprocal action here. But I just wanted to say, to take this moment as the last speaker to thank you for organizing this. I think this has been long overdue, and I'm so pleased to see so many people from across a very diverse set of researchers coming together, sharing these similar questions and frameworks. And I just think it's been very successful. And kudos to you and your team. I know it's so hard to organize workshops, but I feel like it's been pretty smooth. So all things considered, thank you. I just wanted to make one other little quick announcement, which is that Sherman and Phyllis send their love to everyone, and they really wish they could be here, but of course, they have some travel restrictions recently, so they weren't able to make it, but they said, send our love to all our friends and family in cognitive linguistics, sign language research land. So, all right, so I actually was chatting with the interpreters a little bit before, and we were kind of laughing at the fact that today is the day of getting rid of all of our preconceived notions. So far, we've gotten rid of the lexicon, which I'm happy to support that, Ryan. And we've gotten rid of crappy agreement definitions, so I'm happy to support that, Adam. So now I'm here to put myself out of a job, which as a phonologist, I'm going to tell you about how the phonology that you actually know is not a real thing, and we should get rid of that and think about it in a completely different way. And the reason for this is because phonology, as we mostly think about it, is still very much ruled by structuralist ideas, and this is part of just how we're taught about thinking what phonology is and our definitions of phonology. So hopefully I'm here to undo that as well. So the title of my talk is Finding Meaning in Phonology, an Embodied Perspective. And I am technologically not super adept, so I'm going to try to go forward on both of these at the same time. But if I start going forward on my own slides and forget, please somebody tell me to go forward on these slides. Okay, so my talk has a double meaning, and that double meaning of meaning is what do we mean when we say that we're doing phonology, right? What does that mean when we say this is phonology? And the second part is why is there meaning in phonology? Right? So these are kind of two questions that I want to address today. Click and click. Nope? Yes. Okay. So the answers to these two questions, I think, lie in what is usage-based or cognitive linguistics perspective of phonology. And for the second question, we're going to delve into embodied cognition. So this is why the title of the talk is Looking at Phonology from an Embodied Perspective. Okay, so there's three parts to my talk. The first one is usage-based phonology. The second part is embodied cognitive phonology. And the third part is just take-homes. All right? So normally I can actually teach an entire lecture on this topic, so condensing it into 30 to 40 minutes has really been a challenge, but here we go. Am I doing it? Yes. Okay. So in cognitive linguistics, we don't get a lot of fancy tools to just make up whatever we need to account for, and this is something that really drew me to cognitive linguistics. And this is, I'm basing this in Lanneker's content requirement. And this idea of the content requirement basically says that we can't posit anything that isn't real, which I think we can all agree that that's a good tenet to follow. So basically the idea is that there's form and there's meaning, right? That's all we get, form and meaning. Here we have form and meaning. So it's pretty simple. Notice that when we say form and meaning, it doesn't say anything about size. It doesn't say anything about complexity. All it says is there's form and there's meaning. The form is basically just all of the articulatory stuff, right? Whatever you see in that embodied multimodal production of language, that's the form, right? And the meaning is the encyclopedic meaning of the context and the intention, right? The meaning is not just a truth conditional statement, but it's everything about that usage event that we can intuit when we're in that discourse space. Okay, Okay, so there's form and there's meaning, and then there's the symbolic unit. So the symbolic unit is basically just the pairing of form and meaning, right? For those cognitive grammar fans, this is the same thing as the phonological pole and the semantic pole. I'm probably going to go back and forth between using form and meaning and phonological and semantic pole. Just out of habit, I tried to de-Lanacarize this talk for everyone. I got rid of most of my diagrams, which I'm sure you'll be pleased about. But still, old habits die hard, so we'll see. So anytime we encounter a usage event, we get form and meaning. We don't really ever get form without meaning, and it's almost impossible to get meaning without form in a linguistic sense, because the form is the production, right? So we basically interpret the form and meaning through one another, if that makes sense. So in terms of what we have to describe language, there's form and meaning and symbolic structure. And then the only other tools that we have are the schematization across those structures, right? And the categorization that we make across those schematizations. So that's all we get. There's no underlying structure. There's no other fun, complex things. And when we think about schematization, we can think about it like this. And I'm going to show you a little animation here that hopefully will work. Ooh, okay, that's about as technologically advanced as I get, so yay. Basically, what this is meant to illustrate is that over multiple usage events, we have form and meaning and form and meaning and form and meaning, and across each of those, we extrapolate the similarities across those events. And we get more and more schematic, but note that these are not separate levels, these are not disconnected from each other. We're building on that same structure, right? So we can always go back to the instantiations. The instantiations are the actual productions that we get, even though we're slowly building schematization across those instantiations. Okay. Oops, wrong one. This one. Okay. So just to show you how this actually works, here's a nice visualization, I think, from Bybee. Obviously, this is for English, but I'm going to show you in a minute how this applies to ASL as well. So when we think about how these form meaning units come to be, where do linguistic units come from? If we're using this perspective, basically what we have is the usage event, which includes the form and the meaning, and then we're just looking for patterns. What are those patterns, right? So on the left, no, on your right, you're going to see the schematization of played, spilled, spoiled, banned, and rammed. And what you notice when you get all of those usage events is that you have this d, right? That happens. So you have this formal pattern that emerges. But what you also have is a similarity of meaning across all of those, which is this concept of pastness, right? So as we're extrapolating these forms, what we have are this mapping of similarity across form and similarity across meaning, right? On the other side, we have, what do we have? Be, bet, bed, bad, ban, and bin. Hopefully everybody can interpret my North American Canadian-ish vowels there. But the point is not about the vowels, it's about the b. So here what you see is across these usage events, you get b, 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 b. But notice that there's not really any semantics that we can glean across those usage events in order to extrapolate any kind of meaning pattern that goes along with that form, right? So traditionally, one way to think about this is the thing on the left makes a really good morpheme, and the thing on the right makes a really good phoneme. Am I doing that right and left? the thing on the left makes a pretty good phoneme. And why is that? Because the thing on the right, even though it was extracted in the exact same way, is just, it's too schematic in order to make any kind of meaning across those usage events. Okay? Now, how do we do this for sign languages? So here's an example from a paper that I have with Sherman. This is a very low-level schema for usage events involving the word for cut in ASL. So we have the sign for cut looks like this, right? Cut, but we can have a cut on your head, we can have a cut on your cheek, we can have a cut on your hand, and we can have a cut on your abdomen, right? Each of these cuts has this same form, right? This piece of form is the same across all of these. And notice, just like we saw in the D example from Bybee, we can also get some schematic meaning across those as well. And the shared meaning across these is cut, right? Right? So here we can see that across this very small set of signs, we've extracted this A hand shape, which is form, and we've extracted a meaning, which is cut, right? Okay, so now going back to English, that would be so clean and easy if that was how it worked. But of course, like everything, it's much more complicated than that. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have these beautiful morpheme-like things, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have these beautiful phoneme-like things. But here, what we have is some examples that show that the process of extracting patterns doesn't always give us clear categories of phonemes and morphemes. So here on the left, we have end, the sound pattern end, right? Not the word to end in English, but just the sound pattern end. Across the words send, lend, I can't see my own slides, trend, blend, and bend, right? Across all of those, what we have is this phonological pattern, which is end, 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 end. And lo and behold, what we're extracting there is still a phonological schema, because what we're extracting is a coda pattern, right? This is how speakers in English know that these words rhyme, is because we've extracted a pattern across these formal properties that's similar. But notice there's no meaning associated with these across these forms. So unlike a morpheme, even though it's morpheme-sized, there's no consistent meaning, so therefore this is still a phonological pattern. Does this make sense? Okay, and then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have, over here we have glisten, gleam, glow, and glitter, where we have this gl, 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 which on the one end seems like it should be more of just phonemes, but there's still schematic meaning that you can extract across all those commonalities, which is something to do with, I don't know, shininess, right? So to say that gla means shiny is not right, right? We know that if I say, what does gla mean? You're not going to say, oh, it means shiny. So it's not really a morpheme. It's a phoneme type level, but it has meaning attached to it. So again, it's much more messy than this idea of having two bins and we just look at something and decide, oh, this is a morpheme, it goes here, and then this is a phoneme, it goes here. That's more like two ends of a spectrum. And in reality, most things are somewhere in between. Okay? All right, here we go. So going back to sign language, here's an example of a paper that Ryan and I just put out. And this is looking again at this A hand shape, but instead now we're seeing this A hand shape in ASL in the signs far, chase, and follow, which Ryan mentioned before. And what we have here is, again, we've extracted this low-level A hand shape this form that's similar across all, right? You see they're nicely highlighted here. Don't go back and compare my graph of cut to the diagram that Ryan made, because this one's way better. He knows how to do fancy things. But so here you can see highlighted the A hand shape across all of these. And on the top, we also see a pattern that's a formal pattern. But that formal pattern is much more schematic. This formal pattern is basically just movement relative to these two things. Right? So on the bottom, we have this really nice A hand shape, two hands all the way across. That's very consistent. And on the top, the pattern that we extract is that there's movement in signing space, and the meaning that's consistent across those is that the movement represents relative spatial positions of those two moving entities, right? So even though the form is very specific, the meaning is very schematic. And if you read a lot of Lanneker, which I do or don't recommend, that sounds a lot like what he calls grammatical constructions, right? Things that are very highly schematic on the semantic pole tend to be things that are also doing grammatical work. So while this movement might be part of the phonological schema, it's also doing something that's related to meaning, right? It's doing grammatical work. Okay. All right, so basically the two take-home points from this usage-based phonology perspective are these two quotes, which I guess I'll just let you read because that's cruel to make the interpreters interpret me reading them. So the main points here are that units, formal units, emerge from the usage event, right? So this can be a feature level, this can be a phoneme level, this can be a syllable level. It doesn't matter what level we're talking about. The size of the unit doesn't matter. It's extracted in the same way. When that unit is extracted with a semantic pattern, then we call it a morpheme. But sometimes when that pattern that's formal is extracted, it doesn't have a consistent meaning, and then we call it a phoneme. Okay, so, all right, so now Embodied Cognition 101. That's the first part of the talk. So for the second part of the talk, we're going to talk about how to incorporate embodied cognition into this usage-based approach. So there's really three main things you need to know about embodied cognition, even if you've never read a paper about this topic in your life. The first one is that we experience the world through our bodies. Seems like a no-brainer, but when you read a lot of literature about cognition, you sure wouldn't know that that was true. Because all the theories about cognition that are not embodied think that everything about cognition happens in the mind, right? The second one is that experience in our bodies structure how we understand the world, right? This also seems pretty intuitive. The way we interact in our bodies in this world contributes to how we understand it. That also seems pretty straightforward for me. The third one is that cognition and language emerge from these embodied interactions. Okay, so it's through these experiences that structure arises at all, right? So traditional views of cognition tend to think about the brain as a computer, and if you don't believe me, just Google cognition and then look at Google Images, and the first 40 pages are brains and or computers and or brains that look like circuit boards. That's basically everything. So this is really ingrained in Western ways of thinking, is that the brain is the thinking thing and the body is the physical thing. But embodied cognition says that this dual perspective isn't real, that cognition is embodied. Cognition is how we interact with the world. That's what makes us understand and have concepts. Okay, so moving right along. There are several really nice papers on embodiment in sign language linguistics. So I'm not saying that we as a field don't get this, but I'm just saying that I think that we really need to take to heart what it means to think about language as being embodied. And that opens the doors to a lot of ways that we can understand language that are not part of traditional linguistic perspectives. Okay. Amazingly, really the first modern book written about embodied cognition doesn't really have the word embodied cognition in it at all, but it's this book by Lakoff and Johnson that was written before I was born, that really is talking about how language is so embodied that we really can't conceptualize things outside of that embodied experience. If you haven't read this, I highly recommend the book. This actually changed the trajectory of my career. I read this in Phyllis Wilcox's sign language, what was it called? Ben was in the class. Spoken and sign language metaphor, or sign language and spoken language metaphor. But this was the textbook that we used, and I read this and I was like, how have I done linguistics for so long without knowing this, right? And it really just goes to show that when we start thinking about language as being something that comes from the body instead of the mind, that it totally changes the way that we view structure. Okay, so here's some examples of some of my favorite papers about metaphor. And the reason why I have this kind of little transition is that, you know, this book by Lakoff, which is really starting this embodied revolution in linguistics, is all about metaphor and all about how metaphor is structured. You know, conceptual metaphor structures the way that language is structured. And there's actually a lot of work in sign languages on this topic. So Brennan noticed that famously in BSL in 1990. There's been more recent work by Cabeza Pereiro who noticed this is the same in LSE. Phyllis talked about this in her 2000 book on metaphor in ASL. And basically, they all came across this pattern, which is that, wow, we have these kind of opening hand shapes, right, across all of these languages. And these opening hand shapes in all of these languages seem to have this mapping that has to do with things appearing, or things emerging, or things being emitted. And boy, isn't that interesting? The problem is the way that we think about phonology, that's basically where the analysis stops, right? It's just that, wow, look at these really interesting patterns. Sign languages are full of metaphor. That is interesting. But then when you read a book about sign language phonology, we talk about these opening and closing patterns as if they're governed by, you know, well-formedness principles and articulatory constraints and phonotactics. But then where's the marriage of those two observations? Okay. So how do we bridge this gap between embodiment and cognitive approaches to phonology? How do we get to talk about noticing metaphorical or iconic mappings in sign languages while also tying it to these well-documented formal patterns that are emergent in the phonology? If we think that these patterns are also phonological articulatory patterns, those two things must go together, right? It can't be chance that we have these really robust patterns of semantics and these really consistent patterns of phonology, and they don't go together somehow. So basically what I'm proposing is this idea of embodied cognitive phonology, which is a marriage of the two things we just talked about. So it's usage-based and emergent on the one hand. You have units of form of varying sizes that emerge from the usage event. And we have schemas that are formed across those shared forms and sometimes meanings. The embodiment part of this is that cognition involves the interaction of the body in the environment. And because language at its very core is embodied and based in our experiences, that this interaction we have in three-dimensional space is obviously going to show up in our language, right? Because this is what we know. This is how we interpret the world. And what else is language if it's not about talking about our experiences in the world? Okay. So this is kind of the key, I think, or one of the keys, maybe, to bridging this gap. And Sherman basically talked about this in 2004. Sorry, Wilcox, 2004. And he talked about this idea of conceptualizing the articulators. I'm going to change the wording a little and say that we're actually conceptualizing the articulatory event. And so basically what this is building on is Lanneker's observation that phonological space, or the form, the articulatory stuff, is actually part of semantic space. And that might sound weird to say that, right? Because we're probably really used to seeing this. There's the formal pole and there's the semantic pole, and we're used to seeing this, and then it has this little line that shows the symbolic unit, right? But this is actually, I think, a better way to conceptualize this, that you have conceptual space, which is everything you know about everything. And then within that, you have this smaller set of semantic space, which is what you know about the language that you know. But part of that is that you can conceptualize the phonology of your language, right? You know, you can think about it, you can conceptualize it. So this is what Lanneker says. He's like, you can think about how you make the articulation, what the articulation feels like, what it looks like when you're perceiving the articulation. All of that is part of your knowledge of the form, right? That's all part of the semantics of that form. So what I think is really interesting about this is when we're looking at language from an embodied perspective and we're thinking about it very multimodally, that means that any construction that we have is it going to include everything about that usage event. This means facial expressions, this means body posture, this means everything about the form that we perceive when someone articulates it. And what's really interesting about this for deaf people, I think, is that hearing is not really keeping you from seeing what's happening in spoken languages. So part of your knowledge of spoken language phonology is you know what things look like when people pronounce them. So that's part of the usage event, right? If you've ever had the experience of talking to somebody in a language that you don't know, you see their articulations and you encode stuff about those articulations even if you don't know what the meaning is, right? That's part of this embodied perspective. So if we then map this onto this idea of having form and meaning, and sometimes when we're talking about phonology, it's just that form part is fixed and the meaning part is really abstract. The other way to think about that is the meaning part of this semantic pole has just become so attenuated. It's become so bleached over extrapolating formal patterns across so many usage events that there's no longer really a semantic thread that's holding them together. But if you go into that and you look at the systematicity and the breakdown of what makes up that formal pattern, we actually find that there's still a lot of meaning at lower levels of schematization. Okay? So this brings me kind of to my last main point, which is about image schemas. So I keep using this word schema, 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 and this is really important to cognitive linguistics, right? It's this idea that we have these conceptualizations over many, many usage events that we build categorizations from. And you know, Gibbs has said that image schemas represent the essential glue that binds embodied experience, thought, and language, right? And this is a quote that has really stuck with me for many years because it's the essential glue. That must be important, right? We should probably pay attention to that. I feel like essential glue is probably important. So this idea that there's so much work on metaphor and so much work on how spoken languages use image schemas in metaphor, and it shows up in their grammar. And then I look at the sign language literature and I don't see it, right? I don't see this connection between really making image schemas work for us, right? So just in case anybody, I'm assuming this is a cognitive functional crowd, but just in case anyone doesn't know what an image schema is, an image schema is basically a pattern of reoccurring bodily experiences that we have. So from our sensory motor activity, from our perceptual activity, we basically get an understanding of how three-dimensional objects move and interact with each other in the world, and then we schematize across those events. So every time we see source, path, goal, right? We see something start, we see something move along a path, and we see something stop. You can imagine a million scenarios where this is true, right? You can imagine like a child and you're playing with a car and the car has a location and then it moves along that location and then it stops, right? That's something that goes into that bin of an image schema of source, path, goal, right? When you see a bird sitting in a tree and then it flies down and lands on the ground, that's another example of a source, path, goal. Every time you see that, you extract from those things, the commonalities, and you build this image schema, all right? So I was thinking about image schemas, I was reading all of this work, and I'm doing my work on phonology and sign languages, and I was like, gosh darn it, if these image schemas that I'm looking at don't look exactly like the articulations of these signs, right? I had this like moment where I was like, am I looking at a schematic of a sign, or am I looking at a schematic of an image schema, right? And these two things just kind of came together for me. So when we think about an image schema, I'm not going to talk about both of these because I'm kind of running out of time, but on the right, we have this sense of a cross. What does it mean to be across something, right? So we have an image schema for a cross. And a cross necessarily involves a landmark, which is a thing that doesn't move, and then an object that moves, a trajector. You don't have to know that fancy term, but that moves across the landmark, right? And in ASL, no doubt, the sign for cross is like this. It looks exactly like the image schema, right? There's a source, path, goal that's moving across a fixed point. So really, I think it's not a coincidence that the phonological properties of sign languages tend to encode these kinds of things, because why wouldn't you? If you're going from a visual representation of image schemas in a visual modality, why wouldn't you co-opt that? You've already done the work of building the schema, right? Just to give you another example that's a little more complicated, there's an emergence. Sorry, I'm terrible at like peripheral vision. Okay, so emergence and containment are two different, a little bit more complicated image schemas. You can see that it's involving multiple parts here, but you have a container that's necessary for containment, and for emergence, there has to be something that's in a container that can come out of it. Then you have a path movement, either source, path, goal, but either to or from that container. And at the end, you have the thing has either been contained or it's been dispersed, right? So these are basically opposite image schemas. And lo and behold, when I looked across the Morford-McFarlane 2003 tiny corpus that I used for my dissertation, which has 4,111 signs from ASL, that number is scratched in my brain, I found that there's only 5% of the corpus that uses sign internal hand shape change, which that's really what kind of struck me. I was like, why is it such a small percentage? What is this doing there? Couldn't we just have a language that doesn't have any sign internal hand shape change? It seems like it would work equally well. But when I looked into those individual examples of sign internal hand shape change, they looked exactly like these image schemas again, right? So what I found is that you have these kinds of emergence patterns where you have a thing that's contained and then something emerges from that. Or you have these containment image schemas where you have something that's out here and then those things come together to be contained. And as I showed you before with the Brennan and the Phyllis Wilcox and the Cabeza Pereiro, that these are the same patterns that they've been noticing, right? These emergence and containment schemas. Okay. So I just have a couple more slides. I have 1 minute, but I'm hopefully going to extend that a little bit by not making eye contact with the timekeeper. Okay, so embodied cognitive phonology. This is how far we've come. If we accept that all of language is embodied, the door opens for us to consider the ways that languages capitalize on interactions between the body and our perception and the environment. And that makes our lives so much easier. Right? So it's really not a problem with sign languages, it's a problem with theory. It's a problem with fitting a square peg in a round hole, right? Okay. So what are the theoretical implications for sign languages? I have just 3 kind of points here that I want to make, and then 3 little take-home points. So if phonemes and morphemes actually exist on a continuum, beating our head trying to decide whether or not something is a phoneme or a morpheme kind of isn't super worthwhile. Now, if there's lexicographers in the room, they're probably getting very irritated about this, because obviously, if we're trying to make a dictionary, there are reasons why we want to do this. But I also just want to keep in mind that that's not the primary goal of linguistics, right? Making dictionaries is an awesome thing that needs to be done, but if we're interested in what's happening in the minds of the speakers, we shouldn't let those principles guide the way that we think about how language actually works. I'm not looking at you. She just told me to stop. One more slide. Okay, so last slide, I promise. So the take-home message for doing phonology. Whenever I give this talk, people always come up to me after and they're like, so now how do I do phonology? And I don't know if I have a great answer for that. But basically, the way that I teach this is that we start with constructions, right? We start with the construction. That's the basic unit of analysis. And we just keep in mind this fact that there's only form and there's only meaning, right? And that the units are going to fall out of that as they will, of varying sizes of complexity and varying sizes of schematicity or specificity of meaning, right? But that's basically all you get for your tools. Secondly is focus on the distribution of the forms, because form follows function, right? So when we're focusing on the form and defining the form, we're missing out on the sub-patterns that are occurring that are being driven by the function of those forms. So I actually find that to be very helpful. Third is to consider the role of embodied experience. It might help us to understand better some of these visual tendencies that we see across the modality of visual language. You know, we have this problem of explaining why do 30% of signs look the same across typologically distinct sign languages? Well, if we look at image schemas, spoken languages have a lot of similarity in the terms of their form when they're encoding image schemas. Not the phonological form, but higher level form. So I think what's actually interesting about sign language is maybe the level of unit complexity that we can encode this kind of information. And the last one is just, like we should, you know, we always say don't take yourself too seriously. Don't take your categories too seriously. I know categories are really useful for a lot of things, but we can't infer, again, that the categories that we make to be useful for our jobs as linguists is actually what's going on in the minds of speakers. And I think as people who are cognitive functional linguists, we really care about what's going on in the embodied mind, right? So that's all I have. Thank you.